This isn't a hypothetical scenario, it just happened, and most Americans still have no idea. While cable news shouted over immigration and inflation, a quiet policy decision detonated a decades-old energy partnership. Donald Trump, campaigning hard on America First, slapped a 10% tariff on Canadian electricity imports. On paper, it looked like strength. In practice, it was catastrophically stupid, because here's what Trump didn't understand. Electricity isn't like oil. You can't put it on a tanker and ship it to Asia. Electricity flows through wires, through grids, through trust, and for 40 years, one of the most stable and overlooked parts of America's energy system has been its invisible connection to Quebec. Hydropower from massive Canadian dams flows into the northeastern U.S., every day powering homes in Vermont, stabilizing prices in New York, and helping Massachusetts hit climate targets it can't reach alone. Until now, Trump saw Canadian power and thought, charge more. What he didn't see were the billions already spent, transmission lines laid, converter stations built, 20-year contracts signed, all designed to deepen the dependency he just made dangerous. 2 days after the tariffs hit, Quebec stopped selling power on the spot market. They said it was weather, but then Premier François Legault stepped up to a podium and said it plainly. Quebec was exploring legal options to break energy contracts with American states. Think about what that means. The power's still flowing. The lights are still on. But a single policy move just handed a foreign government leverage over the electricity needs of millions of Americans, and no one seems to be talking about it. We are now. What happens when you spend a decade building energy infrastructure, only to discover you just made yourself vulnerable? That's what Massachusetts and New York are grappling with right now. For over 10 years, both states invested billions into long-distance transmission projects designed to import clean hydroelectricity from Quebec. The goal? Reduce fossil fuel dependence, lower electricity costs, and meet ambitious climate targets. The result? They built a trap. For themselves. Let's start with Massachusetts. The New England Clean Energy Connect, NECEC, was no small feat. It took a full decade from permitting to lawsuits to public referendums to get 145 miles of high-voltage transmission approved and built. Construction faced fierce opposition in Maine, including environmental groups and fossil fuel lobbies. But in the end, they won. The project went live in January 2026, with Governor Maura Healey calling it a victory for affordable, reliable, clean energy. It's 7 Norse. The contract? 20 years. A fixed supply of 1,090 megawatts. Enough to cover about 20% of Massachusetts' electricity needs, or around 9.5 terawatt-hours annually. Just months behind, New York is preparing to flip the switch on the Champlain-Hudson Power Express. This one's even bigger. A 339-mile underwater cable running from Quebec to Queens. Cost? $6 billion. Capacity? 1,250 megawatts, enough to power over 1 million homes in New York City. And once again, a 20-year contract, signed and sealed, for clean Canadian hydropower. These weren't one-off projects, they were keystones in both states' climate strategy. And they were premised on one assumption: that Canada would remain a stable, reliable energy partner. That assumption just shattered when Trump announced a 10% tariff on Canadian electricity in February 2025. Most people didn't notice. But 2 days later, the power market did. Quebec stopped exporting electricity on the northeast spot market, where states buy extra supply during peak demand. The official reason? Weather. Warmer temperatures made prices unattractive. But the timing was impossible to ignore. Shortly after, Quebec Premier François Legault stood in front of reporters and uttered a single phrase that shook the energy world. We are exploring legal options to terminate our contracts with Massachusetts and New York. Not threatening. Exploring. But the message was unmistakable, and the leverage was real. Because here's the trap. These transmission lines are purpose-built. They're not interchangeable. They were designed to carry power from Hydro-Quebec and only from Hydro-Quebec. The converter stations, the voltage systems, even the route planning, all optimized for Canadian hydropower. If Quebec walks away, these cables become stranded assets. Billions. Sunk. Trump thought he was extracting value from Canada. What he actually did was reveal just how exposed the U.S. Northeast is. He didn't just create a trade conflict, he created an energy vulnerability. This wasn't just short-sighted. It was catastrophically stupid, because while Trump was busy trying to look tough at a podium, Quebec realized something Washington hadn't fully understood. That when it comes to electricity, they have the leverage. What if your entire energy strategy depended on someone who didn't need you? For decades, politicians in New England and New York have championed clean energy. They promised lower bills, greener grids, and independence from fossil fuels. But buried under those promises was a simple truth no one liked to admit. They weren't building independence, they were building dependency. On Quebec, it started in the 1980s, when New England signed its first long-term power deal with Hydro-Quebec. Vermont led the way, and still today, 25% of the state's electricity comes from a single Canadian contract that runs through 2038. That contract has helped shield Vermonters from the massive price spikes that hit neighboring states during fuel shortages or heat waves. New York followed. In 2024 alone, the state imported 7.7 terawatt-hours of electricity from Quebec and Ontario. That's not a backup supply, that's structural, and it's not just about volume, it's about timing. Because when demand surges during winter cold snaps or summer heat waves, Quebec's hydropower becomes more than just clean. It becomes critical. Let's look at New England. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Canadian electricity made up about 5% of total supply in recent years. But during extreme weather events, that figure can jump dramatically. Why? Because over 60% of New England's electricity generation comes from natural gas. And those same gas pipelines also supply heating fuel. When temperatures drop, gas prices soar, and with them, electricity costs explode. Canadian hydropower acts like a pressure valve. It floods the grid with low-cost, dispatchable power just when it's needed most. Without it, wholesale electricity prices would spike, and so would bills for families and businesses. But here's the kicker. Quebec doesn't need to sell. It has options. Unlike oil, electricity isn't a global commodity. You can't ship it across oceans. It flows directly between connected grids. And Quebec is connected to New York and New England. It's not just the wires. It's the reservoirs, the dams, the infrastructure built over decades to serve one purpose: moving power south. But that infrastructure only works if Quebec wants to sell. And lately, that assumption is looking shaky. Between 2021 and 2023, Quebec's electricity exports fell by 2/3, according to financial disclosures and international energy reports. And in rare moments during 2023 and 2024, Quebec even imported electricity from New York when local demand spiked or hydro conditions were tight. Now add in Quebec's domestic pressures: a rising EV market, electrified heating, and aggressive provincial decarbonization targets. Suddenly, every megawatt sold to the U.S. is a megawatt not used at home. So, when Trump added a 10% tariff, he didn't just trigger a diplomatic headache. He gave Quebec a reason to rethink the entire model. Why sell clean energy at a fixed price to a country treating you like a trade rival? Why support their climate goals when yours are under strain? Why keep a 40-year promise when it's no longer in your interest? These are the questions Quebec is now asking. And they're questions the U.S. Northeast never wanted to hear because the answers expose a harsh truth. This was never energy independence. It was dependence. dressed up in green. And now, with a single trade action, that illusion is gone. If you had leverage this powerful, wouldn't you use it? That's exactly what Quebec did. 2 days after Trump's tariffs took effect, Hydro-Quebec quietly stopped exporting electricity to the New England spot market. The explanation? Warmer than usual weather made spot sales less profitable. That's what the press release said. But then Premier François Legault walked up to a microphone and dropped the real story. Quebec, he said, was exploring legal options to terminate its newly signed 20-year contracts with Massachusetts and New York. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't even threatening. He was stating a fact. Quebec had the legal grounds to reconsider, because the tariffs materially altered the economic terms of the deal. Think about that. These contracts were supposed to guarantee stability. Long-term, fixed-price electricity immune to market volatility. Massachusetts planned to save $50 million per year through the New England Clean Energy Connect. New York expected $17 billion in total savings over 30 years from the Champlain-Hudson Power Express. And now, those numbers are just theory. Because even if the contracts technically survive, Quebec can still retaliate within the rules. How? By delivering the bare minimum required under the agreements. The contracts set floors, not ceilings. Quebec can reduce discretionary exports, especially during peak demand periods, when power is needed most. That means no more last-minute emergency support, no more rate stabilization. Just the minimum and nothing more. And here's the part that hurts. Quebec can afford it. In 2023, Hydro-Quebec earned $3 billion from U.S. exports. It's a meaningful number, but it's not essential. Quebec can scale back. It can sell power to Ontario. It can store water in its vast reservoir network, waiting for higher prices. It can redirect megawatts to meet its own growing domestic demand. This isn't Alberta oil. Quebec doesn't need to export to survive. And that changes everything. Because for the first time in this 40-year relationship, Quebec realized it doesn't have to be the cooperative partner. It doesn't have to swallow Washington's economic jabs. It doesn't have to silently power states that treat it like a junior partner. Trump gave Quebec a choice. And Quebec took it. Let's be clear. Premier Legault didn't target Americans. He repeatedly emphasized his problem was with Washington, not with Massachusetts or New York. But that distinction doesn't matter when the wires go dark. The message was clear. If you treat us like a threat, we'll show you how real that threat can be. What do you tell voters when their electricity bills skyrocket and they realize it was your policy that lit the fuse? Because that's what's coming. Not in theory. In practice, the moment Premier Legault hinted at walking away from energy contracts, governors in New York and Massachusetts started holding emergency briefings behind closed doors. They knew the stakes. Every cent of promised savings, every climate commitment, every clean energy job, all of it depended on Quebec's cooperation. And now, all of it was at risk. Let's talk about the math. Massachusetts told ratepayers they'd save $50 million a year thanks to the NECEC project. That figure assumed full Canadian cooperation, consistent supply, and spot market stability. Without those conditions, the savings vanish, and the state gets blamed for higher rates. New York told its voters the Champlain-Hudson Power Express would save $17 billion over 3 decades. Again, based on a peaceful trade relationship. Now, that number is just a political promise, hanging by a diplomatic thread. And voters don't forget broken promises. They don't blame Hydro-Quebec. They don't follow international energy diplomacy. They blame whoever's in charge when the bills arrive. That's the time bomb. Because this isn't just about electricity. It's about trust. Energy policy is one of the few areas where government meets people, where they live in their homes, through their power outlets, every single day. If that trust erodes, everything else follows. And the climate movement? It takes a direct hit. These contracts weren't just about cheap energy. They were the backbone of state-level climate plans. New York needs to hit 70% renewable energy by 2030. Without Canadian hydropower, that's impossible. Offshore wind is delayed. Solar is throttled by grid limitations. Quebec's dams were the bridge. Now, that bridge might collapse. Worse, the political narrative shifts. What happens when the public starts associating clean energy with foreign dependency? With price spikes? With political blackmail? It's the perfect storm for fossil fuel lobbyists. See, they'll say, clean energy makes you weak. And millions will believe it, because their bills prove it. The irony? This was supposed to be a climate victory, a demonstration that progressive states could lead the transition. Now it's become a cautionary tale. And Trump? He's not the one who will pay for this. He'll move on. He'll blame someone else. He always does. The people left holding the bag will be state leaders, utility executives, climate advocates, and most of all, the voters who believed in a clean, affordable, reliable energy future and are now wondering why no one saw this coming. Because someone did see it coming. They just didn't have the power to stop it. How do you rebuild trust in a 40-year partnership when you've just proven you're willing to burn it in a tweet? That's the real damage here. Not the lights flickering. Not the price spikes. The real damage is psychological, strategic, long-term, because even if Hydro-Quebec keeps the contracts, even if Premier Legault never follows through on legal threats, even if the spot market recovers next month, something fundamental has changed. The trust is gone. Before the tariffs, Quebec treated U.S. contracts like bedrock. Predictable, profitable, low risk. But now, every future negotiation will carry a shadow. What if Washington flips again? What if tariffs return? What if politics trumps policy literally? This uncertainty has a cost. A real, quantifiable cost. Infrastructure developers call it risk premium. The higher the perceived political instability, the more expensive the project becomes. Financing dries up, contract terms shorten, insurance rates spike, and investors look elsewhere. Massachusetts and New York just spent over $10 billion building dedicated transmission lines purpose-built for Quebec Power. Converter stations, substations, permitting battles that lasted years, public trust campaigns, all under one assumption: that cross-border cooperation was permanent. Now that assumption is shattered. And it's not just the Northeast that's watching. Every U.S. state considering international energy projects, from hydro to hydrogen, just got a warning shot. Why invest billions if one federal decision can wipe out the ROI overnight? The chilling effect will be real. Fewer projects, smaller scopes, shorter contracts. And with that comes slower decarbonization, less resilience, higher costs passed to consumers. And then there's the international message. Canada is not a hostile actor. It's America's closest ally. Deeply integrated, longest undefended border in the world. If the U.S. is willing to weaponize infrastructure against Canada, what message does that send to everyone else? It says American deals are fragile, that trust is conditional, that domestic politics always come first, even if the cost is strategic credibility. And that's a problem far bigger than power prices. Because now, every time Quebec looks at a U.S. project, it won't just ask, is this profitable? It'll ask, is this safe? And maybe next time, the answer will be no. The wires are still humming, the lights are still on. But the trust that kept them steady, that's gone. Trump didn't just impose a tariff. He set off a chain reaction that turned reliable power into potential risk. He exposed the quiet truth that northeastern states, blue states, climate-forward states, have built their energy futures on a relationship they don't control. And now Quebec holds the cards. They can't replace the infrastructure. They can't unbuild the transmission lines. Massachusetts and New York already spent billions assuming partnership. And Trump turned that partnership into leverage for someone else. What happens next? Maybe the power keeps flowing. Maybe the contracts hold. But the shadow is there now in every boardroom, every state house, every investor meeting. And that shadow says one thing. This can happen again. Here's my personal take. This didn't need to happen. The relationship worked. The infrastructure was sound. The strategy was smart. I've watched governments get things wrong before, but this wasn't just wrong. This was reckless. And the people who'll suffer? Not the ones in Washington. Not the ones who tweeted the decision, but the people who pay the bills. The families who believed clean energy meant stability. The businesses who trusted in long-term planning. The climate advocates who finally had momentum and now have to fight off skepticism fueled by political sabotage. So here's the question I'm left with. If one man's impulse can unravel decades of cooperation, how secure were we to begin with? And what do we do now, knowing that the next crisis might not be diplomatic, but electrical? Because energy isn't just policy. It's personal. And this time, it got political in the worst possible way. Disclaimer: the views expressed in this video are solely my own. They do not reflect the opinions of any government, organization, or entity. I offer this analysis based on publicly available data, personal interpretation, and concern for long-term energy and climate resilience.